My name is Jason Hart. I'm 27 years old, and I've lived in Colorado for most of my life. Hiking is one of my favorite things to do. I've been exploring trails with my friend Lucas since college, and we're both used to pushing ourselves to cover difficult paths. We're the type who go on challenging, lesser-known trails, always looking for new spots to explore. On a chilly morning last fall, Lucas and I decided to hike a popular trail near our hometown. It wasn't a new path, but it had been a while since we'd done it, so we thought it'd be good to revisit. There was something strange in the air that day, though. From the moment we stepped onto the trail, I had this odd sense of unease, but I chalked it up to the early morning fog that made everything feel surreal. We'd been walking for about 20 minutes when I noticed something strange. Normally, you'd expect to see your footprints in the damp, muddy parts of the trail, but ours weren't there. The ground looked untouched, like nobody had walked on it at all, even though the mud was still soft. I pointed it out to Lucas, and he shrugged it off, saying we probably just didn't notice where we'd stepped. I tried to shake it off, but the strangeness gnawed at me. I felt like we were walking on ground that wanted no trace of us. An hour passed, and we realized that something was off with the trail markers. We hadn't seen one in a while. Normally, there were small signs or colored paint on the trees to guide us, but now nothing. Just trees and more trees stretching endlessly in every direction. Lucas and I were both experienced hikers, so we knew to keep calm and backtrack if we lost our way, but retracing our steps didn't help. Every turn we took seemed to lead us deeper into unfamiliar territory. It was around then that we started hearing distant voices. At first, they were faint, barely there, just soft murmurs on the wind. But as we kept walking, the voices grew louder. They sounded close, yet every time we stopped to listen, the voices would fade, almost as if they were aware of us listening. Lucas tried to laugh it off, joking that maybe it was just other hikers calling out to each other. But something in his voice told me he was just as unsettled as I was. He kept glancing around, his eyes darting to every shadow between the trees. We must have wandered for hours before we stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center of it, there was a man sitting on a log. He looked to be in his 40s, disheveled and shaking, his face pale as though he hadn't seen the sun in days. He didn't seem surprised to see us, which I found strange. He just looked relieved, like he'd been waiting for anyone to find him. "Thank God," he muttered. "I've been lost here for days. I don't know how to get out." We tried to ask him questions, what he was doing there, how he got lost, if he had any idea where the main trail was. But his answers were scattered and didn't make much sense. He kept saying that he'd met other people earlier, a couple of hikers who said they'd show him the way. But then they just vanished. The way he described it, these hikers led him down the trail, talking to him the whole time, and then at some point he turned around and they were gone. Lucas gave me a look, one that said we should keep moving. I could see the unease in his face. We told the man we'd try to find help and told him to stay put, that we'd come back with directions once we figured out where we were. I hoped it would reassure him, but he only gave us a blank, hollow stare. We walked fast after that, and the voices returned. This time, they were louder and seemed to echo around us, like they were circling. No matter how fast we moved, they followed us, whispering just on the edge of our hearing. Finally, as we looped back around the clearing, we saw him again, slumped against a tree. He wasn't moving. His eyes were open but empty. He looked as though he'd just given up. A strange, suffocating stillness filled the air, and I felt a cold wave of dread settle over me. We left as quickly as we could, nearly running down the trail until we finally saw a marker, a real one this time, guiding us back to the main path. When we reached town, we reported what we'd seen. Later, we heard from the authorities that they'd found the man. The official story was that he'd taken his own life, that he'd been lost and disoriented for too long. But I can't shake the feeling that there was something else in those woods, something beyond just getting lost. Whatever it was, it didn't want us there. And when I'm out hiking, I still feel that unease sometimes, like something is watching, waiting for someone else to wander just a little too far. My name is Kevin Daniels. I'm 26, and I live in Spokane, Washington. I've always loved the outdoors, and so has my friend, Mark. We've gone on countless hiking trips together, usually in remote spots that offer total peace and quiet. We're the type of friends who love pushing each other to explore off the beaten path. And that's how we ended up planning a 2-day hike in one of the most remote forests in our area. We set off early on a Friday morning, driving for hours before even reaching the trailhead. The plan was simple: hike up to a small lake, camp there overnight, and make our way back the next day. As we walked deeper into the forest, I noticed how thick and quiet everything felt. It was like the trees themselves were closing in, muffling every sound. By the time we reached our campsite near the lake, the sun was already setting. We were tired but excited to set up for the night. Just as we were unpacking, I noticed something unusual off to the side, hidden partially by some bushes. A tent, faded and weather-beaten, like it had been there a while. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to take a closer look. Inside the tent, there were things you'd expect to see: a backpack, some clothes, a flashlight, and a phone lying on the ground, its screen cracked. But the weird thing was that everything looked untouched. There was dust over everything, and the food in the backpack had long since expired. It was as if someone had just abandoned it all and never returned. I called Mark over, and we both stared at the tent, trying to piece together what had happened. It looked like whoever owned it had set up camp and just vanished. "Do you think they're okay?" Mark asked, and I just shrugged. We both felt uneasy, but we brushed it off, figuring the person might have gotten lost or found another way out. The next day, we packed up and continued along the trail. A couple of hours later, we ran into a small group of park rangers. They asked us if we'd seen anything unusual, and I mentioned the tent. One of the rangers' faces went pale. He said a hiker had gone missing a few weeks back in this area, and that tent sounded like it belonged to him. Mark immediately wanted to report what we saw, but as we looked back, something was off. The area where we'd found the tent now looked empty, with no sign of any campsite. We walked back a bit, searching, but there was nothing: no tent, no backpack, not even a footprint. It was like the whole scene had just disappeared. That night, we were both on edge, but we tried to push it aside. We set up our tent by a small clearing, not far from the trail. It was quiet, too quiet. As the hours went by, we tried to sleep, but something felt wrong. I kept hearing these faint rustling sounds outside, like someone or something was moving around. Around midnight, I jolted awake to the sound of footsteps outside our tent. Slow, careful steps circling us. I froze, not daring to move. Mark whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding. We both lay there, listening as the footsteps circled around us, slow and deliberate. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing by. They were watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I could tell Mark was just as scared. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent, and we held our breath, waiting. Then, nothing. The silence was somehow worse, like whoever or whatever it was still there, listening to us breathe. In a low voice, Mark whispered, "We need to get out of here." Couldn't have agreed more. We waited until the first sign of dawn, barely sleeping, and as soon as there was enough light, we packed up in a hurry. We left that campsite faster than I'd ever packed up before. As we made our way back down the trail, the whole forest felt wrong, like it was watching us leave. Neither of us spoke much, just focused on getting back to the car. When we finally reached the parking lot, we felt a huge sense of relief, but the strange tension from that night stayed with us. Later, I looked up reports about the missing hiker. They never found him, and no one could explain how his tent or whatever we'd seen had vanished like that. Mark and I tried to make sense of it, but we never went back to that forest again. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there, that someone was watching us, and that maybe, just maybe, they didn't want us to leave. Ready to feel a chill run down your spine? Join us in the shadows and dive into the world of terrifying tales and creepy encounters. Subscribe now to Shivers in the Dark and hit the bell so you never miss a story that keeps you up at night. My name is Sam Walters. I'm 29 and I live in Asheville, North Carolina. I've always loved hiking and exploring, so when a couple of friends suggested an advanced hiking trip deep in the Appalachian Mountains, I was all in. To make sure we didn't get lost on the tricky trails, we hired a guide named Oliver, who was known for his experience and skill on difficult routes. We found him through a recommendation, and he seemed confident and knowledgeable from the moment we met. We started out early in the morning, excited and prepared for the challenge. Oliver was a quiet guy, but he clearly knew his stuff. He moved easily through the dense forest, finding paths that we would have completely missed on our own. But as we went deeper into the woods, something about Oliver seemed off. Every so often, he'd glance behind us, as if he thought we were being followed. I asked if everything was all right, and he just muttered, just keeping an eye out. These woods are strange. We walked for hours, following Oliver through a maze of trees and thick undergrowth. The trail was narrow, and the trees were packed close, making it hard to see far in any direction. There was a thick, heavy silence that hung over everything, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig. I started feeling a bit uneasy myself, but I didn't want to say anything and sound paranoid. Then, without warning, Oliver stopped in his tracks. He muttered something about forgetting something important, his voice barely above a whisper. Before any of us could react, he turned and sprinted back down the path we'd come from, disappearing into the trees. It happened so quickly that it took us a second to realize he was gone. We shouted after him, but there was no response, just silence. I felt a chill creep up my spine as we waited, hoping he'd come back. But minutes turned into an hour and then two. We were in the middle of nowhere, lost in a maze of trees with no idea how to get back. One of my friends tried to find the path we came from, but everything looked the same. Trees surrounded us in every direction, and there were no landmarks, nothing to guide us. Panic started to set in as we realized how alone we were. We tried following what we thought was the main trail, but it only led us deeper into unfamiliar parts of the forest. As night fell, we could barely see anything. The trees seemed to close in on us, and the silence felt thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on us. The darkness was absolute, with only our small flashlights cutting through the black. Every little sound, every rustle in the underbrush, made us freeze, hearts pounding, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. We tried to sleep, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear faint footsteps in the distance, and I'd snap awake, staring into the dark, feeling watched. We were exhausted, cold, and terrified. When morning finally came, we tried again to retrace our steps. We stumbled around in circles, hoping to find anything familiar. Finally, in the afternoon, we heard voices and saw figures through the trees. A rescue team. We waved and shouted, relief flooding over us. They helped us back to safety, and on the way, I mentioned Oliver and how he'd just abandoned us out there. The lead rescuer stopped, his face going pale. He told us that Oliver had gone missing months ago during a hike in this very forest. He'd never returned, and they'd presumed him dead. No one had seen him since, and he definitely hadn't been guiding anyone. The news left us speechless. If Oliver was gone, then who had led us into those woods? And why had he disappeared the way he did? As if he knew something we didn't. We never found any answers. I still think about that day, wondering who or what really took us into that forest and why we ever trusted him to guide us.